In the staggering chaos of World War II, entire armies could simply vanish, surrounded, overwhelmed, and erased from the map. In one brutal campaign on the blood-soaked Eastern Front, a massive pocket of 20,000 soldiers was encircled, squeezed, and then crushed. They were swallowed whole by the German war machine, and for the most part, forgotten by history. These men weren't marched to a place governed by convention and law. They were marched to a hell camp, a self-contained world of starvation, disease, and systematic cruelty. This was where their fight for country was over, and a final desperate battle for individual survival was just beginning. This is the story of those 20,000 men, a descent into one of the darkest chapters of the war, revealing the shocking ideology behind their treatment and the terrifying fragility of life for a prisoner on the Eastern Front. The summer of 1941 was a rolling catastrophe for the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's surprise invasion, had ripped through the Red Army. As autumn approached, the greatest disaster of all was taking shape around the city of Kiev. Here, Soviet forces under Colonel General Mikhail Kirponos were caught in a perfectly executed strategic vice. German panzer groups thundered from the north and south, their steel jaws closing to create the largest encirclement in military history, a kessel or cauldron from which there would be no escape. For soldiers on the ground, like 19-year-old Private Alexei Volkov, grand strategy was meaningless. What was real was the constant artillery, the shriek of Stuka dive bombers, and the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. For weeks, Alexei's division had been in retreat, digging endless trenches, fueled by dwindling ammunition. They could feel the cold truth in their bones. Artillery support fell silent, food convoys stopped. They began eating their pack horses and boiling the leather from their boots. Among them was Sergeant Dmitri Shostov, a tough factory foreman who understood the strategic picture by seeing the failing equipment around him. He knew they were being cut off, a noose slowly closing around their necks. On September 16, 1941, the German panzer groups met at the town of Volkov. The cauldron was sealed. Nearly 700,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped. For 10 more days, the trapped armies fought with the ferocity of the damned. Kirponos himself was killed, leading a breakout attempt. Command structures collapsed into chaos. The end came not with a final battle, but with the quiet, sickening realization of utter futility. For our unit of 20,000 soldiers, representing the shattered remnants of this disaster, the fight was over. Gaunt and hollow-eyed, they emerged from the forests, hands held high. They had surrendered, and their suffering had only just begun. The Battle of Kiev alone cost the Red Army over 600,000 men killed or captured. For those captured, it was a journey into an ideology that considered them subhuman. Surrender breaks a soldier. It's the total inversion of everything he's been trained to do. For Alexei Volkov, the feeling was one of dizzying shame as he threw his rifle down and raised his hands. The German soldiers processing them were flush with victory, prodding the prisoners with rifle butts. The first act of dehumanization was taking their personal belongings. A guard ripped a worn photograph of Alexei's parents from his pocket and let it fall into the mud. In that moment, Alexei felt a part of himself being erased. Sergeant Dmitri watched with a cold dread as the Germans brutally separated the prisoners. Officers, men who looked Jewish, and political commissars were pulled aside. The Wehrmacht's infamous Commissar Order mandated their summary execution. Dmitri watched in horror as a commissar he knew was identified, pulled behind a truck, and shot. The message was terrifyingly clear. The laws of war did not apply here. The Germans would later point out that the Soviet Union hadn't ratified the 1929 Geneva Convention, but the reality was rooted in Nazi racial ideology. Slavs were considered Untermenschen, subhumans, whose lives were expendable. This was part of a deliberate plan. The so-called Hunger Plan envisioned starving millions of Slavic people to death to create Lebensraum, or living space, for German colonists. The Soviet POWs were the first victims. The initial collection points were just open fields surrounded by barbed wire, crammed with tens of thousands of men. There was no shelter, no latrines, and virtually no food. Rain turned the fields into quagmires of mud and human waste. The wounded received no medical attention, and their bodies were left where they fell. Rations were a thin, foul soup or a piece of bread made mostly from sawdust, amounting to a slow death sentence. The sacred bonds of camaraderie, forged in battle, dissolved in desperation. It was every man for himself. In this chaos, Sergeant Dmitri clung to his humanity. He gathered a few men, including Alexei. "We were soldiers together," he would rasp. "We will be men together. They will not turn us into animals." Soon, the order came to move. They were to be marched for hundreds of kilometers to permanent camps. This journey would become a new form of torture. It was the Death March. The march began at dawn. Guards beat the ragged columns of men onto the roads. The rule was brutally simple: keep up or die. Anyone who stumbled was shot. The sharp crack of a rifle became a familiar sound. Alexei learned to walk in a trance, putting one foot in front of the other, trying not to think of home, which brought a despair that could stop his legs. Sergeant Dmitri forced his small group into the middle of the column. "If one of us falls, we all stop to pick him up," he ordered. This simple act of solidarity was a profound act of rebellion. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of pain. At night, they collapsed onto the cold ground. Survival depended on foraging: a raw potato, a handful of sour apples, even grass. Water came from muddy puddles, leading to horrific outbreaks of dysentery that ravaged the columns, leaving men too weak to stand. The living had no energy to spare for the dying. Local villagers watched with a mixture of terror and pity. Some risked their lives to throw a piece of bread or a potato towards the column. The prisoners would descend on these offerings like starving wolves. One afternoon, an old woman threw a small loaf of bread near Alexei's group. Sergeant Dmitri stood over it, picked it up, and broke it into 5 meticulously equal pieces. "We eat like men," he said firmly. It was more than food. It was a lesson in humanity, a struggle to keep the soul from being extinguished. As the weeks wore on, the column shrank relentlessly. Of the 20,000 who had started, thousands now lay in unmarked graves along the roadsides. The men were ghosts, skeletal figures in filthy rags. Then, one day, they saw it: crude wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and looming guard towers. They had survived the death march, but as they were shoved through the gates, a more permanent hell was about to begin. The camp was an organized system of despair, an engine of extermination through labor and starvation. The survivors of the march were stripped naked, their heads shaved, and doused in stinging disinfectant. It was here they were finally erased. Each man was issued a metal tag with a number. Alexei was now number 18,754. In some camps like Auschwitz, these numbers were tattooed directly onto the skin of Soviet POWs, a practice later used on millions of others. The barracks were unheated wooden huts, packed so tightly that men could only sleep on their sides on bare, triple-tiered bunks. The stench of unwashed bodies, sickness, and death was overpowering. The day began before sunrise with a PEL, roll call, where men stood for hours in any weather. The weak would collapse and die in the ranks. After roll call came slave labor in nearby mines or quarries, under the watch of brutal guards and capos, prisoner overseers who were often more sadistic than the guards themselves. Food was the primary instrument of death. A diet of ersatz coffee and watery turnip peel soup was scientifically calculated to cause death by starvation within months. Across the German camp system, an estimated 5,000 Soviet POWs were dying each day in the autumn of 1941. Disease was rampant. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis swept through the barracks. The camp hospital was not a place of healing, but a place to die. This was all deliberate policy. Nazi ideology viewed the war against the Soviet Union as a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of total annihilation against what they saw as a population of Slavic Untermenschen. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured during the war, an estimated 3.3 million died in German custody, a horrifying mortality rate of 57%. This was the intended result. Prisoners descended into a state known as Musulmaner, walking skeletons who had given up completely. Sergeant Dmitri fought this spiritual death, insisting his small group talk, remember their names, and maintain a sliver of dignity in a world built to obliterate it. In the face of systematic extermination, survival itself was the ultimate act of defiance. The first rule was to get a good job indoors, away from the lethal quarries. This offered a chance to organize, camp slang for stealing or scrounging anything to survive. A potato, a scrap of leather, a cigarette butt, these were treasures. Sergeant Dmitri, a former foreman, got assigned to a metalworking shop. From there, he managed to get Alexei a job as a sweeper, saving him from certain death. A clandestine economy flourished, with bread and cigarettes as currency. Solidarity was the most powerful tool. Small, trusted groups like Dmitri's pooled their resources. They would hide a sick friend during roll call to keep him out of the death trap hospital. They would prop up a dead bunkmate at a Appel for a day or two so the living could collect his precious bread ration. It was a grim calculus, but it was the difference between life and death. Survival was also a battle for the mind. In the dark, men whispered stories, recited poetry, and sang forbidden songs of home, small acts of rebellion that affirmed their unbroken inner world. Escape attempts were rare and almost always ended in public torture and execution, yet men still tried. For Alexei, survival was a series of small victories, and he owed his life to Dmitri, who taught him how to navigate the camp and find 1 extra ounce of energy when he had nothing left. The end came not with an order, but with the distant, ever louder rumble of Soviet artillery. One morning, the prisoners awoke to silence. The guard towers were empty. The SS had vanished. Cautiously, they emerged, blinking in the sunlight. The gates stood open. Soon, Soviet tanks rolled up to the camp. The hardened liberators stared in horror at the walking skeletons who greeted them. Of the 20,000 soldiers captured at Kiev and marched to this camp, fewer than 2,000 remained alive. They were the survivors of the final battle. This is a story that was almost lost to history. For years, the immense suffering of Soviet POWs was just a footnote. When survivors returned home, Stalin's paranoid regime often treated them not as heroes, but as suspected traitors for the crime of being captured alive. These untold histories are vital. They remind us of the ideological madness that fueled the war and its catastrophic human cost. If you believe these stories matter, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon. In the comments below, let us know what other forgotten stories of World War II you think need to be brought into the light. Liberation was not the end. The survivors were ghosts, physically and psychologically scarred for life. They carried the memory of the dead and the weight of what they had been forced to do to survive. The story of the 20,000 is not a statistic. It is 20,000 individual worlds of hope, fear, and love consumed by the machinery of hate. Their tragedy stands as a timeless warning. When we allow ideology to strip others of their humanity, to label them as subhuman or other, there is no limit to the cruelty that can be unleashed. Remembering these forgotten soldiers is a defense of our own humanity. It's a promise that we will never forget the price they paid, and we will never stop telling their story.